In this session, we're going to go over miscellaneous new features. And what I mean by miscellaneous is that in the last, or in the 3 releases of 2019, there have been a lot of smaller features that didn't warrant 40-minute sessions on their own merits, but I still thought were significant and wanted to cover somehow. And so what I did is took a lot of those smaller enhancements, put them together in this one session. So we take 40 minutes, but we go over a whole lot of smaller enhancements. So that's what this session is about. First of all, legal disclaimer. Then let's go over the agenda. So in case people aren't familiar with who I am, I thought I'd give myself a little introduction. But then we'll talk about the enhancements that were in the original 2019 release, the enhancements were added in 2019 R2, and then the ones that are upcoming in 2019 R3. So first, a little bit about myself. My name is Bruce Armstrong. I work for a company called Integrated Data Services. I've been there since 2004. When I first started with the company, they were doing client-server development using PowerBuilder. We've since moved a lot of the applications over to HTML5 JavaScript, with Java in the middle tier, but we're an ISV, so these are applications which we write for other people, and we have a couple of customers who are still using the PowerBuilder version. So before I joined Integrated Data Services, I spent 15 years as an independent contractor doing PowerBuilder development. So I've been doing PowerBuilder work for a really long time. In addition to PowerBuilder, I know Oracle PL SQL, Java, C#, C++, and there's a number of other things, but those are probably the things I'm strongest in. I'm involved in a number of open source projects. One of them is the open source PFC libraries. I help support that. I wrote a utility called PBNI SMTP. It's a PowerBuilder native interface, so it's a C++ extension for PowerBuilder to send SMTP emails. And then I put together a number of plugins for Jenkins. One of them is takes the autocompile utility that comes with PowerBuilder 2017 and 2019, and uses it to do automated builds of PowerBuilder applications. So if you're looking to do continuous integration, that's something you might want to check into. Anyway, a little bit about the company I work for. Let's get into the enhancements that were initially introduced in the first 2019 release. So there were some changes in the TX text control, or essentially there was changes in the RichTextEdit control, including the reintroduction of TX text control as an OEM control. There was a new Compressor Object and ExtractorObject that was introduced. There were some enhancements in 64-bit compilations, some enhancements in the Standalone Compiler. Yeah, well, anyway, some enhancements there as well. So let's look at the TX text control. What we're looking at now is actually made obsolete by changes that will be coming in 2019 R3. But if you are on 2019 or 2019 R2, this is still somewhat relevant. In the original 2017, Appeon didn't have an agreement with TX text control to continue to provide TX text control as the OEM RichTextEdit control. So they gave you a couple options. One of them was to use a built-in RichTextEdit control, which was actually based on an open source TE edit control. And the other one was to use your own license of TX text control. So you would select this option where it says TX text control ActiveX X14 Professional Enterprise, and at that point it would prompt you for your license key, and you would need to provide that, and then you were able to continue to use the TX text control that SAP had been using in PowerBuilder. So what came around in 2019 was this first option up here, the built-in the built-in TX text control. It was once again an OEM option. So if you were using some features of TX text control that weren't working out so well in the TE edit control, and you didn't want to go out and buy your own license of TX Text Control, you had an option to move forward now, because you could start using the TX Text Control as the built-in OEM solution again. I'm going to skip over most of the rest of this because, like I said, this information's pretty much been made obsolete by the 2019 R3 release that's upcoming. So the next option we're going to look at, the next enhancement, is the compressor object. So there's two objects here. There's the compressor object, which we're going to cover first, and then the extractor object. The idea here is that you take either a blob in memory, or maybe a file, or maybe a list of files, and you compress them down. Either store them, where you just take many files and convert them into one file, or you even compress them, or you create one file out of them, or create a much more compressed area of memory, but you use some algorithm such as a zip to compress the amount of space they take. So look at the functions here. There on the compressor object, there's a compress function. Now it can take either a folder name, one or more files in an array, or a blob. This is memory essentially. And the destination, if you pass in a folder name or one or more file names, the result is a single file. If you pass in a blob, you get a blob back. The format is what kind of compression technique you want to use. So it's optional. By default, it will use zip, so you'll get a zip format. There's also 7-zip. 7-zip is a open source zip alternative that does zip, but also does its own custom version of zip with some different options. And then there's gzip and tar. Now, if you're coming from a Unix environment, you're familiar with those. Tar is a storage format. It doesn't actually compile. It doesn't compress anything. It just takes multiple files and turns them into one file. Whereas gzip is the Unix version, basically, of zip, where it actually does compression. Often in the Unix environment, they tar a series of files and then gzip the tar file, so that unzipping is essentially a two-step operation where you unzip it and then untar it. Okay. There are some events on the compressor object. There is too far. Start and finished events that fire. You don't necessarily have to do anything with them, but if you want to time the compression, you can use those two events to figure out how long it took to do the compression. Processing file, if you passed in an array of file names, it would respond back to you with the name of each file as it started working on it. Size completed triggers regularly to indicate how far along it is in the compression, so you can give status feedback to your users. And if anything goes wrong, then the error event goes off. There's a number of properties here. There's a compression format and a password. So the compression, the compression level. So there are 6 different levels. It starts off with store, and this is essentially the same thing as if you tarred a file. Store just takes, let's say, a group of files and turns them into a single file. Then you get the fastest compression, fast compression, normal, maximum, best. This is an increasing order of compression, but it's also an increasing order of amount of time it takes to do the compression. And then the password property, if you set the password property on the compressor object, when it creates the compressed file, that compressed file will then be passworded. And when you send that file to somebody else, they will need to supply that password in order to extract the files back out of that file. Taking a look at how these different levels of compression are achieved. Zip, store, once again, is no compression. But then to get greater levels of compression, it increases the number of fast bytes it uses, and it does multiple passes. So initially for fast, fastest, and normal, it would only do one pass, one compression pass. For maximum, it will do 3 passes, and then for best, it will do 10 passes. So much greater compression, much longer time to do the actual compression. 7-zip, similar. Difference here. Oop, I went too far again. Sorry about that. Difference here is that what it's using here is fast bytes and dictionary. So to get greater compression, it increases the number of fast bytes it uses, increases the size of the dictionary it uses. For gzip, almost somewhat similar. And once again, I went too far. Similar, it's increasing the size of the dictionary, and then like zip, it actually increases the number of passes it makes. So in the case of gzip, makes 2 passes or 7 passes rather than 3 or 10. And once again, the increase in size of the byte dictionary. And then for tar, remember tar is a storage format, so it really doesn't matter which of the options you indicate. It's only going to do a store in every case, because that's what tar is. It's a storage format. There's no compression going on at all. Okay, so now you've taken all your files and you've compressed them. You want to extract them back out. Well, that's what the extractor object is for. So there's a extract function on here. Once again, like the compress, it has a source, a destination, and a format. If the source can either be a file or memory, a blob. The destination will be a folder if the file is the source, or it will be a blob if a blob is the source. Once again, the format is optional. Default is zip. Now, there were 4 different compression formats supported by the compressor object. The extractor object actually supports more. So there's the zip, 7-zip, gzip, and tar that the compressor object supported, but the extractor object also supports RAR, ZMA, and ZMA86 as extractor formats. There are similar events on the extractor object as there are on the compressor object. There's a start and finished. If it's a multi-file, if the file is composed of multiple files, it will tell you the name of the file it's currently decompressing. Once again, there's a size completed event that's fired on a regular basis to tell you how far along it is in the decompression, and an error event that fires if there's an error. Okay, that's the extractor object. Now we're going to look at some of the 64-bit enhancements. The first one's a bit of a fix rather than necessarily an enhancement. In the previous versions of PowerBuilder, when you did a 64-bit compile and ran it, and it did registry functions, it was still accessing the 32-bit registry. And so that's been corrected. And now when you are compiling as 64-bit and it accesses the registry, it accesses the 64-bit registry like it's supposed to. One problem, though, for PowerBuilder with the 64-bit registry is that the 64-bit registry can support 64-bit numbers, which are actually bigger than the data type arguments that were available for the registry functions. So what's been done is they've added a new reg long enumerated value in order to indicate that the data that needs to come back or be sent into this particular registry value can handle up to 64 bits. So that's now fully supported. And then finally, 32-bit and 64-bit applications can coexist. There's no runtime conflict. Okay, the next one is where Appeon made a liar out of me a little bit. That's what I like to say, because in my previous sessions when I talked about the standalone compiler, I mentioned that the only feature that if you took the project painter in PowerBuilder and looked at all the options that were available on it, and you looked at the command line arguments that you could provide to the standalone compiler, you could see that there was a command line option for every single property in the project painter except for one, and that was the ability to specify on a pibble by pibble basis whether the code in the Pibble should be compiled into the executable or whether it should be compiled into a PPD or DLL, depending on whether you're doing pseudocode or P-code or machine code compiles. So I didn't think that Appeon would ever do this, but they did. They added a /pd argument, which now allows you to specify on a Pibble by Pibble basis where that code gets compiled. It's very similar to what's in OrcaScript. There's an important difference though. So the default, and this is part of the default. Part of the difference is that there's a default value. The default is compiled to PBD or DLL. So obviously, if you just do the compile without providing this flag, you will get an executable and then a PBD or DLL for every Pibble. It passes a series of flags, just like in OrcaScript, where if you had 20 libraries, you would pass 20 yes/no flags, indicating what was supposed to be done for each Pibble. This is where the difference is, though. In OrcaScript, if you had 20 libraries, you had to pass 20 flags. If the /pd argument, you don't have to do that. You only have to specify the flags up through the last Pibble you want to specify control over. After that, then the default, compiling to a PBD, takes effect. So here's an example, and we're going to do it with 3 libraries. So let's say I've got 3 libraries, and I pass in /pd yes, no, yes. So what it will do is it'll take the first and last libraries, and it'll create PBDs or DLLs from them. But it will take that second library, and it will put that code into the executable. Okay, makes sense so far? Let's say I say /pd no, no, no. Well, I've told it now no for all the Pibbles, and so now it's going to put everything into the executable. There will be no separate PBD or DLL. But let's say I say /pd and only pass 1 no. Okay, what's going to happen here is that the libraries that I didn't specify anything for by default will take on yes. So the first Pibble gets compiled into the executable, the next 2 automatically get PBDs created for them. So you don't have to pass a flag for every library in your application, just for the ones up through the point where you don't want the PBDs created for them. Okay. Okay, let's look at the R2 enhancements. There are a number of enhancements here. One was the use of NativePDF by default. There were some enhancements to the CoderObject, to the CrypterObject, to the ExtractorObject. There were some source control enhancements, and then there's a group of what I call other enhancements. So NativePDF by default. So the option we had with NativePDF up until R2 was that there are settings in the data windows themselves that indicate how the save as PDF is supposed to be done. And you're basically, up to this point, there were 2 options. One is to open up every single data window and change those settings so they point to NativePDF. That was one option. Not a real good one, but that was one option. The other option was you could take the PBINI file, and there's an entry you could put in the PBINI file that would say use NativePDF by default. But what that meant you had to do, though, is take that PBINI file and deploy it with your application so that the PowerBuilder executable, or the application executable, would see it and use the setting. This makes it a bit simpler. Instead of using the PBINI file, there's now a property on the application object itself. And if you set that tells the application, ignore what's on the data window, use NativePDF for the export. Okay, look, we're going to look at the CoderObject. This is what had, for example, base64 encoding in it. So base64 encoding is the encoding that is used a lot, but there's some cases, particularly one-time temporary passwords that are used for 2-factor authentication, where base 32 encoding is used. And so they added in R2 base 32 encoding and decoding functions. Also, there's sometimes when you don't do a base 64, necessarily a standard base 64 encode, but a base 64 URL encode, which is a minor variation of the base 64 encode. And so they added options for the base 64 URL encode and decode as well. And then finally, in the CrypterObject, there was already an asymmetric generate key, which would generate keys for asymmetric encryption, the public and private key for asymmetric encryption. But now they've added a symmetric generate key for generating a symmetric key for symmetric encryption. In the ExtractorObject, now I talked about it for the original 2019 release, but in 2019 R2, they enhanced it. There are now functions that will give you the number of files and the list of files that are in the compressed file. So if without having to extract the file all the files first, you can call these methods and find out how many files are in there and what's the name of the files, and most importantly, the extract function before would simply just extract all the files, but now there is an option to extract individual files. So if you get a compressed file that has 100 files in it and you only wanted one of those files, now you could extract that one file without having to extract the other 99. Look at source control enhancements for SVN and Git, both. The commit dialog now shows you what objects are being committed, and then if you double click on the objects, it will allow you to see what the changes are in the individual objects, so you can actually see what it is you're about to commit. Also, prior to this, a number of the application properties, what you would think were application properties, you'd go into the application painter and you'd go to the properties there and you would change them, but those properties actually weren't being stored in the source code of the application object. They were actually being stored someplace else. And so in 2019 R2, Appeon corrected that so that anything you change in the application painter now actually is stored in the application object source code, so that it actually gets version controlled when you check in the application object. For subversion only, there's support now for the in R2 for the SVN needs lock property. What this was important for is subversion supports locking, but developers didn't always have to do it. You could open up an object and make changes to it and then try to commit it. The problem you would have if you didn't have locking in place is that another developer may have opened up that object and started working on it as well. And if they committed their changes before you went to commit yours, you would find that Subversion would be telling you at that point that there is a merge conflict, that somebody else has made changes to this object since you first pulled it down, and that you've got to resolve those merge conflicts, those changes. You need to bring that other developer's changes down into your project and address any conflicts before you can actually do your commit. So, there's two ways to deal with that. One is you just deal with it. You just have merge conflicts and have to deal with it. The problem with that is that in dealing with merge conflicts with PowerBuilder code is rather tedious. So if at all possible, you want to avoid that. And the way you avoid that is by locking the file first. So you could still do that. You could still lock the file first. And if the other developer decided to change the object without locking it first and tried to commit their changes, they would get blocked at that point, saying that you've already locked the file, and so they can't commit their changes until you do. But that leaves that developer in bad shape because they've made a bunch of changes to the object, not realizing you had it checked out. And that's where SVN needs lock comes into play. SVN needs lock says you aren't allowed to edit an object unless you check it out first. And that so if you lock an object and you start working on it, that prevents other developers from even checking it out. Not checking it out, but not working on it until they are able to check it out. And that means you've submitted your changes and you don't get the merge conflicts. Okay, so rather a long explanation there, but it's a really important feature. They also added support for multi-languages and file names and directories, and enhanced the get lock. So now, if you have an out-of-date object and you try to do a lock on it, it will also update your copy of the object to the current version, so you don't end up editing some old code. And finally, forget. This in R2 is when they first introduced support for branching. Now, you still had to do it if you wanted to switch branches, for example. You still had to do that outside of the PowerBuilder IDE. And we're going to address that with some R3 changes. But this is in R2s when they actually first supported branching in the PowerBuilder for Git. Look at some of the other enhancements. So there's a placeholder option now for a single line edit. And I'll go into what each of these means. This should say RadioButton. Sorry, DataWindow Checkbox and RadioButton support vertical centering. There is a new DataWindow Bitmap expression. The rich text data window now supports save as PDF. All the other formats, other than Olay and there's another one I forgot the name of, but also don't support save as PDF. But rich text originally didn't support the save as PDF. It now does. This is kind of a nice new feature. There's a new picture selection dialog. It makes it a whole lot simpler to pick out resources, the bitmaps that are supplied with PowerBuilder that you might want to use in your RibbonBar or in your toolbar on your menu item or whatever. And there's been some enhancements to the browser as well, which is we'll see all these. And an open containing folder option. So let's do the placeholder first. So if you look at this window, you'll notice there's no labels on any of these fields, but you notice also this grayed out text actually within the single line edit. That's a placeholder. It's not data. It's essentially the label. This is the first name field. This is the last name field. So as long as there's no data in the field, it will show the placeholder. And as soon as you put data in the field, then the data shows, not the placeholder. Here I actually got it right. This is RadioButton, not RibbonButton. So, and you don't see it quite so obviously here with the, what you see here is that the vertical centering does work. For the checkbox, at runtime it works. In the editor, it still shows it as if it's actually top aligned rather than vertical centered. But when you go to when it actually runs at runtime, both of them will actually now show centered. This is the bitmap expression. So what's happening in this data window here is I have a file name here on the left, and then on the right I have the bitmap image, and not necessarily bitmap because these are actually PNG files. But the name of it refers to the name of a picture file, and then this is the expression. It's not a picture control. It's an expression that references this column to get the name of the picture to display. So this is the one that where I have the file name and the extension. Here I was playing around just to make sure that it didn't need the extension, so I just gave the name of a file without an extension, and it was still able to render it correctly. And then this file doesn't actually exist, and I don't get a runtime error. I just don't get the picture. As I said, the save as PDF has been around for a while. It just wasn't supported by the rich text data window, and that's been corrected now, so that you do a save as PDF for the rich text as well. This is that new picture selection dialog, and so they have sort of broken down categories in which the icons might fall into, but what's also real nice here is the search option, so you can actually type in some of the text. If you know the name of the icon you're looking for, or have some idea of what the name of the icon is you're looking for, you can type that in here, and the matching icons will display. So it makes it a whole lot easier to browse through the system-supplied image resources that you might want to use in your application. And then similarly, in a way, I guess, in the browser, there is now a search bar. So that if you're looking for a particular object, you can actually type a few characters of the name of the object and find it a lot faster than just scrolling through a list of a couple hundred system classes. And this is the open containing folder option. So you're in the Explorer in the PowerBuilder IDE, and you can go to the workspace or a target or a pibble, and you can see open containing folder, and the Windows Explorer will open up to that location. Really useful, for example, if you need to do something with the source control options that aren't available through the PowerBuilder IDE. This will take you right to the folder that the source code's in. Okay, now we're going to look at the 2019 R3 enhancements that are upcoming. First one is that we're now separating the runtimes from the IDE. There's some additional source control enhancements. There's some PowerBuilder IDE enhancements. There's enhancements to the RibbonBar. There's changes to the PBU conversion functions. And there is this is what I was referring to earlier, where I said that information that was in R1, R2. Actually, well, it was originally introduced in R1 and continued in R2, but now R3 kind of has upset the apple cart as far as the rich text editor. So this is more, particularly if you're moving to R3, the information you're interested in if you use a lot of rich text edit features in your application. But let's go to the first thing first, separating runtimes from the IDE. This is a really slick feature. Now, it doesn't work going backwards right now. It works starting in 2019 R3, and as they release additional versions of the runtime going forward, the IDE will then be able to use its current runtime version or earlier. So you may have, I'm sure you've all faced the situation in which there's some new release of runtime out there, and maybe you've got 10 applications, and you've got a bug in one of those applications where you need some fix that's in that new runtime. The problem is that if you take your PowerBuilder IDE and you migrate it to that new version, anytime you do a compile from then on, it will be on that new version. And that means all 10 of your applications have to be migrated if you're doing routine releases of each of them to that new version. And what that means, of course, is you're going to have to go test them all. So that always gave moving to a new version of the runtime a bit of a barrier. And this is designed to eliminate that barrier. So what you can do, this is in the system options of the PowerBuilder IDE, is you can specify what version of the runtime you are compiling for. So you might be on, let's say, 2020, and you might have some applications that are still running 2019 R3. You know, in this case, 2556, the actual, build version, build number. And you don't want to migrate them necessarily to 2020 yet, because you don't want to go back and do any all that regression testing on them. What you could do is, with the 2020 IDE, is you could work on 2020 applications, but you could also go back and compile applications targeted for the 2019 R3 runtime. I mean, literally, you could have 10 different applications all targeted at 10 different runtimes and use the single IDE to support them all. So that is a slick new feature. So what's happened to make that work, and we're looked at when we look at the runtimes for the RichTextEdit control, is that now when you can install multiple runtimes on your machine, and each of them gets stored into a separate directory, and that's how you avoid having you're forcing you to migrate your runtime all the time. That's what allows you to go through in here and select the runtime you're actually going to deploy for. Let's look at source control enhancements. There is a new option in when you say connect workspace. This is where you're going to, you don't have the workspace yet. It's in source control. You're going to go grab it. Just in case the pibbles in the workspace in source control aren't up to date with all the source control changes, there's an option now that says refresh all pibbles. And so what it will do, the IDE will go grab all the pibbles, all the source code, and then it will make sure that all the pibbles are updated to the latest version of the source code. I mentioned that branch was supported in R2, but you had to do the switching outside of the IDE. That's now moved within the IDE. You can do switching between branches in the PowerBuilder IDE. And the PowerBuilder IDE will show you which branch you're working on. Another source control enhancement, this is for both Git and SVN, is you can specify when you do your added source control what encoding format you want to use for the source code. And that becomes important, not necessarily for US users, but if you're a user in an area that's using a multi-byte character set or right to left, there may be some encoding formats that work better for you as far as your source control. And so now you get to choose that. There's an edit conflicts option. Remember, I was talking about merge conflicts a little bit earlier. Prior to R3, if you had a merge conflict, you had to go out to the file system and use a third-party tool to manually do the resolve the edit conflicts. You still have to essentially manually resolve them, but you can now do it directly from the PowerBuilder IDE. And you're still using a third-party tool. You're still using Tortoise Git or Tortoise SVN, but it's a lot simpler to do now. And there's also detailed error logs in Git and SVN. And once again, referring back to people dealing with multi-byte character sets, the project directory can now contain multi-byte characters. So if you're in an area where you're using a multi-byte character set, you're fully supported now. Okay, the enhancements to the PowerBuilder IDE. So prior to this version, if you use the browser to go find an object you were interested in, and you said, okay, here's where this object's at. You then had to go back into the PowerBuilder IDE and go find the library it was in, and then open it up. That's changed now. If you're in the object browser in PowerBuilder, you find the object you're interested in, you can open it directly from the browser just by double clicking on it. kind of the same thing. If you have a data window and it uses a drop-down data window style, what you used to have to do is you'd look at the name of the data window object, and then you'd have to go search in every library in the system tree to find out what library that data window was in, and then open it. That's changed now. What you can do now is you can select an option that says modify drop-down data window, and that will automatically open in the editor for editing. All PowerBuilder system dialogs have been updated, and they support resizing. This is, in a way, this is kind of big. I know some dialogs have driven me nuts because they only show about half the text I need to see, and they have a scroll bar on them. I have to scroll back and forth, and they were non-resizable. So that's been addressed. Every PowerBuilder system dialog now is resizable. Not only that, they've actually changed the layouts. So some of the dialogs had a number of tabs on them. Maybe too many tabs on them, and they've kind of readdressed that as well. They've tried to make things so you don't have to tab quite or click quite so many times to get through the PowerBuilder system dialogs. And then last thing here, when you add a column to a existing data window, the column is now enabled by default. It used to be disabled by default, and they're assuming here the whole point of adding the column to the data window is because you want the user to work with it, and it has to be enabled for them to do that. So why not make it enabled by default so they don't force you to enable it after you've added it. We'll look at the RibbonBar enhancements. Previously, if you were using a RibbonBar and you were using graphic resources in it, you'd have to deploy those graphic resources individually with your application. Begin with R3. You can create a PBR file, and those graphics resources will then be compiled into the executable. In PBU conversion, this should say units to pixels and pixels to unit. The issue was that if you had rather high resolution monitors, the values that you would be using with those two functions would actually exceed the size of the data variables being used with them, and or could at least. And so the arguments and the return values have now been increased to longs in order to support higher resolution monitors. This is the item that I was referring to at the very beginning about R3 kind of invalidating some of the information as far as the rich text editor support for R1 and R2. So you still have the TX Text Control ActiveX Professional Enterprise option if you want to provide your own license. That's not really necessary anymore. There is the built-in rich edit control, which is now considered obsolete and really not recommended for use any longer. But the difference now is that there is the built-in TX Text Control ActiveX 15 rather than 14 for use for 32-bit only, but there's also another option now for the built-in TX Text Control ActiveX 28 for 32-bit and 64-bit. Now this is something new. This is something that TX Text Control only introduced in March or so, was a 64-bit version of the ActiveX control that PowerBuilder is OEMing. So now you can use TX Text Control, and it can be used in both the 32 and 64-bit environment. Now with the initial release of R3, I believe that it won't be using the ActiveX 28 for 32-bit. That will only be for 64-bit initially, but in a later release, it'll be available for both 32 and 64-bit. That would leave the ActiveX 15 available basically just for backwards compatibility. Really moving forward, then the best option to use is the TX Text Control ActiveX 28, which will work with both 32 and 64-bit deploys. Now this is where I was saying about the runtime files. So if you're going to do a 32-bit compile and you're going to use the version 15x, what's going to change with R3 is the directory you go to look at for those runtime files, because as part of the separating the IDE from the runtime feature, it's now possible to install multiple PowerBuilder runtimes on your machine and switch between them. So there's a new directory now. It's in the Program Files 86, Appeon, Common, PowerBuilder, and then there'll be a number of these folders where I'll say runtime, and I'll have a version number. And those will be, each of those folders will represent a different version of the runtime. So when you're looking for the version of the runtime files that you want to deploy with your application, you need to know what build number of the runtime you were using to compile to, and find that folder, and then copy these files. In the case of the version 15 of the control, copy these files to deploy with your application. If you're using the version 28, which would initially is just for 64-bit, you're going to go to that runtime version folder, and then you're going to find the x64 folder underneath it, and find the 64-bit DLLs that go along with that version. Notice that there's, in addition to being 28 rather than 15 for as part of the file name for a bunch of these files, there's some additional files now that get included with the version 28, including some stuff from MFC and the Visual C++ runtimes. Okay. That's about it. Given that we're probably at about 40 minutes already, I'm not really going to have time to do a demo of these features. What I will mention in closing, though, is that I would recommend checking out the community.appeon.com, not only for the Q&A sessions, Q&A forums that are on that site, but also there's a number of blog articles. The sample code for many of my presentations is up there in the Code Exchange section, so I really recommend checking that out. And otherwise, thanks for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Elevate 2020.